Hello, I'm Peter Harrington, and today we're going to talk about improving government communications, why it matters and how to do it. So, in the course of this presentation, I'm going to take you through why it matters, talk a little bit about what communications entail, what makes effective communications, some of the common problems and challenges in communications in government, and some ideas about how to improve communications, particularly in challenging contexts. Let's start with, why do communications matter? Why do we do it at all? Surely governments are there to do things, to implement policies. Why is it important to think about how government interacts and talks to the public and other stakeholders? So, first of all, communications matter for delivery. Communications and delivery go hand in hand. A good way to think about communications is that by engaging your stakeholders and explaining what government does, communications can create the space for delivery to happen. And the most important thing in developing countries, especially fragile states, expectations of the public, and actually move things forward. And so if you don't have that political consent and consensus, it's very difficult to do that. So legitimacy. Communications create legitimacy for the government. It helps people acknowledge and respect and get behind what the government is doing. And as Samuel Huntington said, there is a very vicious circle. New democracies are in a catch-22 situation. Lacking legitimacy, they cannot become effective. Lacking effectiveness, they cannot develop legitimacy. So good communications can help you break out of that catch-22 situation. Public information and education are very important, especially in low-capacity contexts where public knowledge might not be extremely developed about what government does and how it does it. It's very important in a democracy for people to understand what government is doing. It's part of an educational function and process which is related to the idea of a sort of demand side for good governance. Government supplies governance, that's very important, and you can try and improve it, but you need, particularly in a democracy, a public who are informed consumers of what government does, because that actually makes the product better. So public consent. I've spoken a little bit already about how communications create the space. It's very important to create support, consensus and consent for your program of government. What your policy agenda is, what you're actually going to do. If people resist it, your stakeholders don't want it, it's going to be very, very difficult to execute that. Accountability. Communications are essential to create a circle or a cycle of accountability between the government and the public. In many ways, good communications can actually strengthen the delivery outcomes that a government tries to achieve. Because when a government makes public commitments to build a road or build a bridge or reform a tax law, it has made a promise. It has made a public promise, and it's a promise that if it doesn't keep, the public will hold it accountable and will come back and may vote at the ballot or criticize the government, make its life more difficult. So making public promises that you then have to keep can actually sort of drag government to actually have to follow through. There's a phrase somebody used, which is the communications tail can wag the delivery dog. It's a very clumsy phrase, but it gives an idea of actually sometimes, in some cases, communications can actually help drive delivery. Which brings to that last point itself, precisely what I've been speaking about. It actually helps make people follow through and actually execute, again, the most important thing in a developing world context. So it's about creating an enabling environment and this virtuous circle between making promises, keeping them, getting credit for keeping them, communicating so people know you've kept it and getting the credit for that, and then making more good, realistic promises. It also matters for democracy. I've touched on this, but I love this quote from JFK's speech, The President and the Press, that he gave at the Waldorf Astoria in 1961. Without debate, without criticism, no administration and no country can succeed, and no republic can survive. That is why the Athenian lawmaker Solon decreed it a crime for any citizen to shrink from controversy, not primarily to amuse and entertain, not to emphasize the trivial and the sentimental, not to simply give the public what it wants, but to inform, to arouse, to reflect, to state our dangers and our opportunities, to indicate our crises and our choices, to lead, mould, to educate and sometimes even anger public opinion. So thinking about democracy, not all countries are democracies, but it's a fundamental part of that contract between the public and the government. So, moving on. What do communications entail? I just want to talk a little bit and explain from the ground floor so that people who aren't communications practitioners or know a lot about it can understand what we're talking about here. I'm talking about external communications. Now, in many different countries, people will define and use the word communications differently. I've seen plenty of communications departments in government which are internal phone systems, IT, keeping walkie-talkies charged, all kinds of basic technical. Yes, it's communications, but what we're talking about today is external communications between the government and the public. That's the first thing to understand. It's about being outward-facing, and it's incredible how many communications departments are actually not outward-facing at all, even though they are communications department in name. So very basically, we're talking about liaising with the media, generating speeches, managing web and social media, particularly websites, a much bigger and increasing share of government's communications than 20 years ago, an increasingly important, very powerful channel. And also, depending on how a department is structured, events and other media services, it could be AV, audio-visual media, cameramen, audio recorders, and so on. But the fundamental thing to remember is that it's about the right information in the right form to reach the public at the right time to achieve a particular set of objectives. Try and hang on to that definition, that concept. And, keeping that in mind, I think more important than these sort of descriptive baskets about what they are, about what happens in an external communications department, it's more important to think about what are the functions, what are the actual things that you're doing when you're communicating, and that will help us think about what effective communications look like. So there are 4 core functions, at least in the way that I thought about this in my work. First of all, you're forming a strategic narrative and messages. This is extremely important. It's about the government explaining not just what it's doing, but why. Secondly, you're planning and coordinating activities. This is really where communications sink or swim. It's essential that a very large, complex set of institutions try and speak in a consistent, coherent way. It's incredibly difficult to actually do that in practice, and we'll talk a little bit about why. Number 3, shaping, distributing information and content. This is just a very basic, obvious, stock in trade, the bread and butter of what a communications department does. But it's harder than it sounds to do it well. But this is really just putting together material and getting it out there through those channels that we saw here. And lastly, monitoring and responding to emerging issues. It's very important that in addition to being proactive, there's a reactive capability to manage what crops up, because the media environment, the communications environment that we live in today is dramatically different from 50 years ago or even 10 years ago. It's very fast moving, news cycles are changing, they're much faster. This might not necessarily be true in countries where you work, but still, it is accelerating everywhere. The rate of acceleration might vary, but it is accelerating. There is no question about that. So being able to keep track of what's happening and respond to it effectively is very important, also very difficult. So what makes effective communications? Sounds like it ought to be a straightforward question, not all that straightforward. Well, let's go back to our first, our 4 functions. Let's start with forming a strategic narrative. There needs to be leadership. You need somebody in charge with a mandate, a communications lead who has access to the principal and who has access to policy advisors and people involved in policy who can lead this process of defining the strategic narrative. Now, that principal could be a minister, it could be a president, it could be a head of an agency, but it's about if there's a decision maker and your responsibility of an individual or of a department is to execute communications for the institution that principal heads, you absolutely need access, and you need to be integrated with the decision making at the very top. And we'll come back to why we don't always see that being the case. Next is the process. You need, informing a strategic narrative, you need a clear, effective process to actually build some clear objectives. So, if you have your overall narrative, you have your sort of overall idea, what you really need is to connect that narrative to what the principal or the institution's actual agenda is. If their agenda is to, if it's a Ministry of Public Works and its agenda is to focus on roads, the communication strategy needs to reflect that. It's no use talking about something else, doing one thing and talking about something else. It has to be, connected and based on that actual agenda. And you need a process to make sure, a process in terms of, conversations based on the access that you have here, actual time to sit down and form and hash out that, that connection. You need a capacity to gather and analyze and understand your audiences. First, understand who your different stakeholder audiences are. It might be the public, it might be people in a particular region for a particular issue, it might be youth, it might be young people, it might be women's groups, it might be the international media or donor organizations. So in different contexts and at different times, every institution has a set of sort of existing audiences, but at different times for different issues, you have to think about, constantly ask the question, who is our audience, and shape your strategic narrative to that audience. But to do that, you need to actually have the capacity and the time to find ways to understand what the priorities and understandings and opinions of those audiences are. You need to find a way, and this is very, very, very difficult, to share. Once this narrative is created, let's say, in the case of Barack Obama, okay, yes, we can is a little bit simplistic, but he set out a clear vision for America, before his 2008 election. You need a way to make sure that everybody in the government is aware of what that is, okay? And so you need processes, conversations, meetings, engagement with different stakeholders to try and make it coherent and consistent. And finally, you need to actually enforce that this message permeates and is used and repeated and replicated in all of your actual outputs. So when you write a press release or you write a speech, why are we doing this? Does it fit with the overall strategic narrative, which itself fits what our actual policy agenda is? Have we mentioned our 3 or 4 key messages in this speech? Doesn't matter if you go and give a speech to, some small fishing village about a particular, reform of the fisheries laws. If the media is there, it's an opportunity for a principal or a speech giver to mention some of the things which are, part of your overall agenda. But you need enforcement. You need a way to watch what what other people in your department are doing and what people in other ministries who are talking about the work you're doing are actually saying as well. So next, planning and coordinating activities. I've already spoken about clear central control and leadership. This is more just, this is about more than just one director of communications or a clear individual who's in charge, has that mandate and that access to the principal. It's also about some centralization. And this is a difficult topic. This is, really one of the most difficult areas in doing government communications is having centralized control. But unless, just like in any organization, you have a public affairs department and they have sign-off over design and over press releases and some control over when staff go and speak to the media, and they might train and coach staff members before they go and speak to the media. It's exactly the same in government. You need some kind of office or central function which has a gatekeeper role, which has some ability to control and have sign-off and sort of some coordinating role to maintain that coherence and consistency. Even if you have that, that's not enough on its own. You need access to information, and we'll come back to why this is so difficult in a lot of developing country contexts. Coordination is bad, so you don't know what other units or departments or ministries are doing, And also, there isn't very good factual data. There isn't very good sort of empirical or quantitative data, in the system in existence. But you need to try and create processes to access information, and I'll come back to that. You need a disciplined routine. You need regular meetings, daily, weekly, monthly, where it's very clear what conversation you're having. It's clear what the agenda is. You're looking ahead, not looking backwards. It's amazing how many communications meetings happen in government where you're talking about, well, we messed up that story last week, instead of thinking, what's happening this week? How do we get in front of it? I'll jump over here to this concept of multi-cycle planning. Imagine a 3-lane highway, and you have a slow lane, a middle lane, and a fast lane. It's useful to think about communications in government a little bit as though you need to be driving in all 3 of those lanes at once. So in the fast lane, because communications is happening, there are different parallel cycles that are all happening at the same time. Your fast lane is your day-to-day news cycle. You've got it's moving quickly. You haven't got much time to react. You have to put out a brief statement or a press release, and you need processes, daily meetings, which allow you to manage that daily cycle. But if you only have daily meetings, you'll never stand back and say, okay, what's going on? You'll never get ahead and be strategic and feel as though you're on top of news and issues and that kind of that communications environment that you're trying to deal with. You have to then operate in the middle lane, which is your weekly routine. What's happening this week ahead? Who's managing that speech? Have we made sure that we're announcing the right messages in that speech that's coming up this week? Are the right press invited? What other things do we need to do? Oh, there's a power plant being opened, or there's a new generator coming online. Have we actually given a notice to the press to actually make this information public? And then you need the slow lane, which is your monthly or 3-monthly cycle to take a long look at the horizon, push your horizon out and say, what's our bigger message here? Where's public opinion? What's happening with our policy agenda? Are we transitioning our message from this is all about power and roads and ports, and now we're actually starting to talk about human development, education, health. And so you need to be driving in all 3 lanes at once. You need people whose job it is to drive in those 3 lanes at once. But you need to be thinking on 3 levels all at the same time. That's this multi-cycle. And finally, you need tools that help you do this. So having some sort of a planner or a tracker which enables you to plan ahead and plot in what's happening, and then without that tool, these meetings and this sort of 3-lane thinking isn't actually that helpful, and it's a way for you to capture what's happening and try to record this information and know where your gaps are. So it all fits together. So shaping and distributing content, as I said, this is the bread and butter. You need to gather and shape. So you need a way to commission information about what government is actually doing. If you're in the White House, you need to know if the Department of Labour is making an announcement today. You need to know if the EPA is about to bring in some new regulation. You need to know what's actually happening and create channels for those people to feed information. That comes back to central control, having that mandate, being able to actually sort of enforce people telling you what's happening. You need to be able to process and simplify information. So you need people or a person or a capability within your department to take complex sort of policy information and digest it, refine it from crude oil into jet fuel, so that it's actually usable by your audiences. And you've got this digestion process you should refine with your audience in mind. Okay, we're talking to the international press, this is how we write it. Very different if you're going to a local community group in a particularly rural part of the country. Documenting the activities of government, using those different channels, and you need obviously to review and fact check. I've already talked about distribution, but you need your processes, your cycles of regular press conferences, the materials that are going to make those press conferences effective, accurate, up-to-date media database. It's not all about the media. It's important to think about events, think about speeches, other ways that, community town hall meetings, listening sessions, engagement forums, all kinds of ways, and of course the radio, all kinds of ways that you can engage your audience, which isn't mediated by the media. And of course, finally, deploying spokespeople to speak on behalf of government is a fundamental part of that. Only effective if you have some clear control, some information, you're planning ahead, and you have some of these factors in place as well. Very briefly on monitoring and responding, what's crucial here is you need to know what's being said on the radio and on the press and in the newspaper. You need to have a very rapid way to make decisions about what do we need to deal with and what don't we, because you can't deal with everything. It's a fire hose of information flying at you, and then you need to make decisions about how to respond. And what enables you to do that is to have a clear protocol which is understood by everyone. And I'll speak a little bit more detail about that in a few moments. So this all sounds so straightforward, wonderful, easy, great on paper. I can hear so many of you saying, so easy to say all this wonderful stuff on a PowerPoint, but actually doing it is so hard. It's particularly difficult in developing countries. And I know this because I've worked in developing country contexts, inside government, not as an external advisor, but inside government, and I see I've seen the day-to-day. So there's a lack of human resources. First of all, there's just not enough people to get the job done. There's infinitely more work than there are people. This is the problem not confined to developing country governments, but it's more acute. It's harder to find skilled and disciplined staff. It's the capacity talent problem that is talked about so often. Also, even if you have the perfectly talented, wonderful staff in a communications unit, your counterparts in other ministries and your policy counterparts may have exactly those same constraints. So one of the challenges with communications is you rely so much on your channels of communication and your conversations with other members of government. Internal communications is the bedrock of good external communications. And so those constraints can cause you enormous problems. We've already spoken about the lack of accurate and available data. Even if everyone in government is absolutely amazing, your audiences or your press are very constrained. There are very low publishing standards. The bar for what will find its way into a newspaper in many countries and contexts is extremely low. And communications professionals can tear their hair out saying, well, why on earth has that been published or written that way? Other times, pieces can be copy and pasted straight into a newspaper, and that when that happens, you have to think about making sure that what you put out to the press is in the right form. We can talk about corruption and market failures in many countries. There is not a sustainable market for the media to actually be profitable and exist, independent of some reliance for payment or money from either companies or government to make sure stories are actually disseminated. And so that breaks down. It's a very, very big, very separate conversation, which is not the one to have here. But what you really see there is it breaks down that adversarial but productive relationship between the press and government of keeping each other on their toes. If you just can pay the newspaper to put whatever story you want, why ever bother making it good? Why bother making it newsworthy? The media in some way, at least, when they're good and effective and focus on news, at least make government work hard to formulate and shape that content into forms that are going to be actually used by newspapers, run as news, interesting to their audiences. High public expectations, low education. I talked a little bit about the beginning about this issue of managing expectations, especially in a post-conflict country. There is a race, in a way, between the expectations of the public and what government can deliver. And the government is trying to kind of close that gap. Communications can help you do that, but ultimately talk alone is not what closes that gap. It's delivery that will do that. So thinking about communications as a way to enable delivery, but it's still, you're facing high public expectations. Reforming communications is, I think, more difficult than reforming a cabinet office or reforming like a policy unit. Why? First of all, everybody is a communicator. Everybody's an expert. Everybody thinks they know what the top line or the headline should be or what the main message of a speech should be. Everyone has an opinion because we are, all human beings are communicators and we all think we're good. And so getting people to understand, perhaps in a context where there isn't a very developed professional category of communications, it's quite hard to persuade people, actually, no, there's a real technique and methodology to this and a skill set which is very important. Also, it's very, very high profile. People, it's embarrassing. If if things go wrong, the stakes are very high and important people will be embarrassed and affected. And so it makes, because those stakes are high, it makes changing things quite hard. It's hard to take risks and to try and make structural changes that will improve communications. It's just an area of great stress and pressure for a lot of principals, which makes it particularly difficult. I think the important thing to remember is nobody does communications that well. Not in America, not in the UK. It's a complete shambles behind the scenes most of the time. I mean, there are a couple of countries, and you can probably tell I'm from the UK, and there were very, very interesting reforms put in place in the late 90s by the Labour government that centralised and made communications quite effective, but you also run into problems of the trust and the relationship between the government and the media starts to break down when communications is too controlled and too much this idea of spin. But particularly this coordination thing, the expression herding cats doesn't even begin to sort of express how difficult it is to try from a central position to create consistency and coordination, and also to form a strategic narrative, which I'm about to come to. So let's talk about some common symptoms that some of you may recognize. Communications feel reactive, stuck in firefighting mode instead of being proactive and getting ahead. Everybody in communications role around the world says, we need to get ahead, we need to be proactive. Everybody knows this, but everybody also constantly feels as though they're on the defensive and scrambling to respond to crises rather than getting ahead. The two things I would say about that is that one is you're always going to feel like that, but two, there are ways to improve it, which very much related to some of what I've already spoken about and which I'll come to. It feels disjointed. I've already spoken about this. Jumbled or conflicting messages. The Ministry of Public Works said this, but then that afternoon the Ministry of Agriculture said something completely contradictory. What on earth is going on? Why couldn't we get on the same page about this? It's unclear of who's in charge of what. And particularly a problem in developing countries, which I didn't mention, is sharing of information, hoarding of information. It's often about trying to maintain bureaucratic power and control. Communications feel stretched. There's just not enough people to do everything, working long hours, running to keep up, and highly pressurized, under a lot of stress to manage the press, deal with negative stories, and meet those public expectations and commitments that I've spoken about. These are symptoms, there are very common causes. The number one issue, the number one problem, which is almost everywhere, and it doesn't matter whether it's a rich country, poor country, a company, a government, there is a lack of a clear narrative and mission. And people walk around saying, why aren't our communications better? It's because they've never stopped to sit down and say, what are we actually trying to say? What is our actual fundamental message here? And they've never bothered to try and connect it to what they're actually doing. So either they have a slogan, but it has no relation to what they're doing, or they've never actually sat down and formulated that core kind of nucleus from which everything else conceptually flows, and make it very simple. Lack of a clear, able leader who has trust and access to the principle. I've spoken about that. It's self-evident, but it's amazing how consistently this is a problem, that there is somebody who's technically in charge of communications, but who is not part of the top high level of decision making. Communications is integral to decisions about not just what to say, but what to do. But it's so consistently built in as an afterthought. Okay, what are we going to do? Right, we've made a decision. Now let's go and tell the press officer what to say. Instead of having a conversation which says, what should we do in thinking about what to do? How are we going to present it? What's the right way to sequence this information? And let those two things shape one another. Lack of resources. It's very difficult. It's not straightforward to solve that, but there's a sort of a process or a cycle between doing communications better and then being able to make a better case to get more resources. They're under-resourced because people think, well, it's always a mess, so we're not going to be able to do it. And so trying to fix some of these underlying problems can also help to alleviate this sometimes. So lack of a central control mandate and a stick to actually enforce it. We've spoken about this, but it's amazing how frequently people in different ministries or agencies don't really have any central communications function to answer to, and so there's no one at the centre who has a clear mandate to say, sorry, but you can't make that announcement today. You have to make it tomorrow because it's going to clash with something else we're doing over on this side in a completely different sector. And that that department who's coordinating, whether within a ministry or across government, and the leader of that department aren't mandated with a kind of stick to enforce. The most effective, heads of communication or spokespeople are the ones who, when they call, that they are calling, and they call with the authority of that principle behind them. Lack of talent and skills, very difficult. It's far beyond the scope of this conversation to talk about how to solve that, but it's worth recognising that's what's really underlying this, and we've talked about lack of available data as well. Lack of trust is really interesting. I think that this issue about not wanting to share information and actually say, well, here's our plan. If there's some sort of delivery unit who's responsible for moving the airport forwards, you often see situations where people don't want to share that planner. They don't want to share it because there isn't trust that it's not going to be used or credit be taken for work, or it's going to leak. So trying to build up some of these systems and processes over time, when people see the win-win of what can come when communications are done well, when policymakers trust communication staff to say, okay, let's take what you're going to do, we're going to build a little plan around the opening of this airport, we're going to make everyone look really great, everybody feels good afterwards, those sorts of successes build trust. Finally, so how to improve communications in challenging contexts. We've talked about why these contexts are particularly challenging. Here are some interventions that can be effective, and I've grouped these into the 4 areas that I've been talking about, these 4 functions. First of all, forming the narrative. The most simple and first thing that a communications person can do, or a reformer, or somebody who's tasked with improving government communications, is ask the question: what is the overarching fundamental strategic narrative, and is it connected to the policy agenda? And often it's not there, and it's not connected to the policy agenda because the policy agenda has not been clarified and crystallized. And so it brings us back to this idea that communications can often get blamed for a problem which is not really about communications. To some extent, it can only work with the level of clarity of strategy which already exists. And so you work with the tools that you have, you work with the content and the material that you have. If the government does not have clear priorities which can be communicated and expressed and summed up in a couple of sentences, you're never going to communicate well. And so it comes back to this point about communications is not this bounded sort of circumscribed area. It's got to be closely integrated and part of conversations about what are our priorities. And so if you're a reformer of communications, you need to push back and say, well, is the policy agenda clear? What are our priorities? If you give me 3, and is it fewer than 100? It's no use having 100 priorities. You can't communicate, because if you throw 100 balls at people, they won't catch any of them. But if you throw 3 or 2, they might. And so, again, I can't emphasize enough, often if this is the core problem of communications, often that core problem is actually only a symptom of a problem at the even more strategic level. So, if it's your sense that is missing, you can try and convene a process at the top. We're going to talk about top-down and bottom-up. Convening a process at the top to engage your principal, whoever their sort of kitchen cabinet of advisors are, whoever the really important, influential people who help shape that kind of what are we doing next? What's our one-year plan? What are we trying to achieve? Conversations. You've got to get those people involved. If they're not engaged and your communications plan doesn't reflect what the principal and their advisors are actually doing, it's not going to be effective. The bottom-up side, once you've established and had that conversation or tried to convene it, and it can be quite difficult to do that, to persuade them that it's even necessary. It's a very, very difficult thing. I don't want to breeze past it and pretend that that's easy. But you also need to get broad input. You need to listen to people, lower down within the institution and stakeholders outside of the institution as well. Understand, how is this strategy and institution coming across, or this agenda coming across. Thirdly, forming the narrative, simplicity. I've said you can't have 100 priorities. You've got to have 3. Absolute simplicity, short words, basic ideas, little alliterative phrases. A great example is the phrase in Liberia, small light today, big light tomorrow, which summed up their message around electricity and power. It's extremely basic, but it builds an expectation. That is a wonderful, simple slogan. And then in terms of actually trying to match messaging to the impact and make those messages stick, once you have that kind of overall brief narrative, you need to create some messages like small light today, big light tomorrow. That's not a great example of an overall government slogan, but it's an example of a sort of key message which is which comes under that overall narrative. You can use set pieces, let's say an announcement of a power plant or a particular reform or the opening of a new road, to actually embed those messages, make them stick, get them out there, and it creates this cycle of success. It creates this oh, that worked. And we can talk about some examples later. And again, in this idea of embedding that narrative throughout the government, which I spoke about earlier, you can have messaging sessions, let's say going to different parts of the ministry you're working in, or different ministries in the government, to say, this is our overall narrative. These are our 3 core messages that together make up that overall narrative. This is, and within that narrative, there's a clear vision, a clear mission. It's like, what's the mission of the government? What's it trying to achieve? But you actually need to go out, talk to people and tell them what those are, and say, this is how you need to incorporate this. Every time you do a press release, you've got to think, can I work these messages in here? Can I relate it to this government's agenda? It's very hard work. It's never perfect, but trying to do that in a more consistent way reaps dividends. On coordination, essential to clarify roles. There's so much confusion around, well, is it this person's job to talk to the press at this time, or is it whose job is it to manage the tracker? Whose job is it to go and get information from from this policy unit? Whose job is it to actually sign off on press releases and so on? So clarifying the roles within your department and between communications departments across government. Getting a clear mandate. We've spoken about that. You've got to go to the principal and say, I need you to explicitly back me to go and do X, Y, and Z, because otherwise there's no momentum there. Establishing some quality controls. Again, this is quite a sort of processual issue, but some stopping points where a press release or a speech has a process by which it gets created and approved. Putting in some straightforward systems and templates to try and standardize the quality of outputs is really important, and helps over here as well. So I've spoken about sharing templates, using a tracker. I've spoken about the system of meetings, daily, weekly, monthly, 6 monthly, to be at the ground level, 100 feet, 10,000 feet, and then 40,000 feet, or 3-lane highway, or whichever way is easy for you to think of it. Finally, when you're going to talk to people, to say, this is why I need you to tell me before you make an announcement. This is why I need you to check in. You need to explain why it's in their interest to do that. It's no use just going, okay, you need to go with a stick, which is getting you a clear mandate, but it helps if you have a stick and a carrot as well, to say, this is why it's going to be helpful for you, because then you're not going to clash with Ministry of Agriculture's announcement that happened at the same time. I'm actually doing you a service by trying to coordinate and kind of smooth out the tempo of government outputs to find the win-win. Distributing content, it's a lot about skills, frankly. Writing, communication skills. So you need to do whatever you can to build the skills of the people in this institution, whether it's workshops, whether it's training, whether it's scholarships and education, whether it's how you do your recruitment process. The fundamentally most important aspect is skills. Listen to your stakeholders. If you're going to be refining and trying to target your audiences, you need to understand what they're actually saying, and what their opinions are. So conduct surveys, conduct some kind of audit, stakeholder audit, to understand, well, what do women's groups actually think or care about. It's not about obsessive polling necessarily, because that's expensive and time consuming, but starting to build that capability to understand. It's not by accident that that governments do poll extensively. Obviously, there are dangers about being completely driven by polling. Build clear information flows, sources. So this is your policy unit, your delivery unit over here, your different parts of government which are telling you what they're doing, and you've got a person or a function who controls that grid, this tracker, who controls it. Somebody owns it, and it's looked at every week in that weekly meeting. You know that you can rely on them to actually pass you information. So there's an agreement which you've defined with that kind of win-win conversation and your stick. And so they're actually, so you can trust that your tracker is a pretty good comprehensive picture of what's going on and what's coming up. It's all about being forward-looking. Clarify the roles. I've talked about that. And building trust again is this. You can trust me. I'm going. If you share information with us, it's going to be in your interests. Distribute the wins, making sure that credit for when things go well is distributed. And again, understanding your audiences and segmenting them well. And then finally, on the monitor and respond, you've got to create a system of media monitoring. Maybe if it doesn't exist, then you need to create it. Some way to look at the newspapers and listen to the radio and create a summary of what's happening. But it's no use circulating a summary at 3 p.m. It's got to be done. It's got to be in people's inboxes by 7 a.m. or on their desk by 7 or 8 a.m. or 9 at the latest. Because unless you do that, you can't execute that process of triaging and deciding how to respond. To do it early, create templates, simple checklist for how to triage. Again, simple systems that people can follow. Keep the templates and all of your tools and instruments very, very simple, really easy to use. Try and design a clear protocol about how to do that triaging and then responding decision-making process. So who needs to be in that meeting and in that conversation every morning? Is it the press officer, the director of communications, a couple of ministers, and one of the presidential advisors? Which decisions do you need to take to the principal or your head of state? What sign-off do you actually get to do what? And I think this is really important. Don't over-engineer or complicate. If you can do it over the phone, do it. If it's a question of lack of resources because people don't have scratch cards, then find some way around it or some place that you can meet. Don't try and have some really high-tech online conference call. Just keep it really simple. All it needs to happen is a conversation. If you can't all get on the same conversation, then have somebody whose job it is to speak to everybody. But make it fit with people's daily routine, but become a part of it, and not make demands of the system or the resources that are available to you that those resources can't meet. And finally, get senior buy-in. I think we've spoken about that. There's got to be a point where the decision maker looks at this sort of triage. Okay, we've got to respond to this and this story for these reasons. I need a decision from you about issuing this statement and so on. Most importantly of all, identify your internal and external stakeholders. Understand their interests. Internal stakeholders, when I go and talk to that other ministry, external, public, different groups that you're trying to communicate with. Because if you don't understand their interests, you'll be missing. So, just in the final couple of slides, I want to talk about what essential kind of principles come out of everything that I've been speaking about. Leadership. I've hammered away at this, but it's so important and it's one of the number one problems. Having a clear lead who has the ear of the principal, who can influence that process of defining and refining and crystallizing the mission, and then finding a way to communicate that mission in a very simple way. Clear messaging, having a clear agenda and supporting messages. A clear overriding slogan and some supporting priorities, whether it's power, education, and health or trade, whatever it is, make it clear and make it quite simple. Regular planning, gathering information and using it strategically. We've talked about how essential that is, but unless you're planning, you're always looking over your shoulder instead of looking in front of you and thinking what's coming up, how do we make the most of it. If you don't plan ahead, if you don't drive in the middle and the slow lane as well as the fast lane, you'll never be able to make the most of an upcoming event like some new piece of infrastructure that's about to be opened, because you're just going to tell people about it at the last minute. The press will write whatever story they want instead of you being able to get in front of it and have a clearly sequenced communication strategy that you can execute. So you can write stories on if it's happening on the Friday, you issue some stories on the Monday about some of the people involved, the process. As it gets closer to the day, you start to deploy some spokespeople or some ministers on the radio talking about why this is such a important milestone for the country. On the day, you have a ceremony where you invite the press. In the speech that's given at the ceremony, all of your key messages are hit, and it's well written and it's well prepared and it's been looked at by the principal. The right media are there, and they've all been given the right materials to take away and then write their story about what happened. And then after it's done, you continue to do work on the radio, or you go and talk to stakeholder groups about why this is a good thing. And so having that plan and trying to execute it as coordinated way as possible and get that message incoherent enables you to reap the benefits, which then builds trust in communications and makes your job easier. Discipline coordination, it's all about discipline. Having that meeting on time, doing your media monitoring early, responding quickly. The first half an hour of your response to a particular crisis, the first half hour is absolutely essential to shape the direction that story will go in. If you take 3 hours to decide what to do, and the press office has gone off somewhere else and gone to lunch for 3 hours, it'll be a disaster. That first half an hour will determine what direction that goes. And finally, good posture. Almost finally good posture. Having that proactive stance towards the media and the public rather than just being reactive and waiting for them to come to you. And then I did want to talk about truth. It is an essential principle of communications. It's I think, a widely held myth that good government communications is about spin, is about misleading, is about misdirection and kind of always putting the best foot forward. I 100% wholeheartedly disagree with that idea. If communications is about building the trust and the relationship between the government and the public, then transparency and truthfulness and openness is fundamental to that trust. Communications should never lie. It doesn't mean that everything that comes across your desk gets churned out or posted on the internet or on the website every moment. Of course, you think about your messaging, you think about how to explain what you're doing in the simplest way and to put your best foot forward, as a government to explain what's happening. But hiding things, misleading, or outright untruths is absolutely disastrous for a government, because it will always come out. Most importantly of all, if this is the final slide, if there's one thing that I hope I've touched on, more than touched on, emphasized, but I want, if there's one thing that I would want people watching this to remember and walk away with, because it is my governing philosophy about communications. Individuals, governments, presidents, communications professionals as well, make the same mistake the world over. Policy is what is the doing, and then as an afterthought, communications is the talking. So you decide what you're going to do, and then you go and get the communications guys, and you say, okay, go and present it, make it look nice. Wrong, absolutely wrong. That's just to emphasize how wrong it is. It's absolutely two sides of the same coin. They are a cycle that should shape and influence one another. How we decide what we do and when should be informed by how we're going to communicate it, what's important to people. Communications is more than just presentation. It's about trust, that relationship, that compact, that legitimacy. What's important to people? How do we show that we're responding to people's priorities and concerns? How do we also push back on some of those public opinions and say, actually, well, no, government has to show leadership here and say this is more important than this, and then make that case. But what you do and what you say are part of the same conversation. And so if you do one and then the other, your communications will always fail to do justice to what you're actually trying to do. So effective communications is not about what you say, it's about what you do. And even communications is a doing. It's not just about thinking actions and talk. Communications, like anything, exactly like policy, it's about what you do. Because ultimately, it doesn't matter if you're in the most sophisticated and developed country in the world, or in the most poorly educated, poorest country in the world. People know the difference between truthful communications and spin, because they have eyes and ears and they have common sense. It doesn't matter how educated you are, you know if the feeder road was built to your village or not, because you can see it's either there or it isn't. And so if you do one thing and say another, you will get called out. It doesn't matter which public you're trying to communicate with or which stakeholder group. People know the difference. And so unless you actually substantiate your promises and deliver, your communications will always fail. That's the end of my presentation. I hope that's been useful. Thank you very much.